He was 5 years old when he began composing. Not picking out tunes, composing, constructing pieces with harmonic structure and internal logic, which his father would write down because the boy could not yet notate them himself. He was 8 when he wrote his first symphony. He was 14 when, after a single hearing of a 9-voice choral work in the Sistine Chapel, a work whose score was kept under church secrecy under threat of excommunication, he went home and wrote it out from memory without a single error. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in Salzburg on January 27, 1756, and died in Vienna on December 5, 1791. He was 35 years old. In those 35 years he composed more than 600 works, symphonies, operas, piano concertos, string quartets, serenades, masses, and chamber music of every description. At a level of quality and invention that has not been equaled in any comparable time span in the history of Western music. The question of how this was possible is one that has been asked since his own lifetime and has not received a satisfying answer. The Grand Tour and its costs. Leopold Mozart, Wolfgang's father, was a violinist, composer, and author of a widely used textbook on violin technique. He was also a man who understood immediately that his son was something unprecedented, and who made the promotion of that something the organizing principle of his life. Beginning in 1762, when Wolfgang was 6, Leopold took the family, Wolfgang and his older sister Nano, who was herself a gifted musician, on a series of concert tours across Europe that lasted, with interruptions, for more than a decade. The young Mozart performed at the courts of Munich, Vienna, Versailles, London, and Amsterdam. He played for Maria Theresa, for Louis XV, for George III. He improvised on themes proposed by the audience, sight-read complex scores at first glance, played with a cloth covering the keyboard. The tours established his reputation across the continent and gave him something more valuable than fame, an education. In London he met Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of Johann Sebastian, whose elegant, singing melodic style influenced Mozart's own approach to instrumental music for the rest of his life. In Italy he studied counterpoint with Padre Martini in Bologna and absorbed the traditions of both opera seria and opera buffa. At 14, he passed the examination for membership in the Accademia Filarmonica of Bologna, the youngest person ever admitted. What the tours cost him was a childhood. He spent his formative years in coaches, inns, and royal reception rooms, performing on demand for audiences who saw him as a marvel and occasionally as a curiosity. His health suffered. His formal education was sporadic. And his relationship with his father, who loved him and managed him and never quite distinguished between the two, was complicated in ways that shaped him permanently. The Archbishop and the kick. Returning to Salzburg meant returning to employment under Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo, who took office in 1772 and had a view of musicians as household servants. Mozart was appointed concertmaster and court organist. He was required to produce music on demand, forbidden to travel for extended periods, and treated with a contempt that was entirely standard for the relationship between aristocratic employers and working musicians in the 18th century. A relationship that Mozart found intolerable in ways that most of his contemporaries did not. The break came in 1781 in Vienna, where Colloredo had summoned his household. After a series of confrontations, Mozart submitted his resignation. The archbishop refused to accept it. Mozart insisted. The matter ended when Count Arco, the archbishop's chamberlain, threw Mozart out of his office, literally, by kicking him out the door. Mozart wrote to his father afterward describing the episode with a mixture of outrage and barely concealed satisfaction. He had become, at 25, one of the first independent professional composers in European history, a musician who would live or die by his own talent and the public's willingness to pay for it, without the security of a permanent court appointment. Vienna, the operas. Mozart settled in Vienna and in 1782 married Constanze Weber. Not the woman he had originally fallen in love with, her sister Aloysia, who had rejected him, but the younger sister, whom he loved with a warmth and directness that his letters make unmistakable. Leopold disapproved. Mozart married her anyway. The Vienna years produced the work for which he is most remembered. His piano concertos, 27 in total, the majority written for the subscription concerts he organized to generate income, redefined the relationship between soloist and orchestra, making the interaction between them genuinely dramatic rather than merely decorative. His last 3 symphonies, written in the summer of 1788 in a period of approximately 6 weeks, represent the peak of classical symphonic form, the 39th a work of sunlit serenity, the 40th in G minor a piece of such concentrated lyrical intensity that it has been called the first romantic symphony, the 41st, the Jupiter. Concluding with a 5-theme fugue that combines strict counterpoint with the freedom of the sonata in a way that had never been attempted before. But the center of his creative life was always opera. His 3 collaborations with the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte, The Marriage of Figaro in 1786, Don Giovanni in 1787, and Così fan tutte in 1790, constitute the summit of 18th-century opera and arguably of opera in any century. Figaro transformed an inflammatory political comedy by Beaumarchais, banned as subversive in Vienna, into a study of human psychology so precise that each character is defined not by their words but by the specific musical language Mozart gave them. Don Giovanni, written for Prague, where Mozart was adored in ways that Vienna's fickle public never quite managed, opens with a murder and ends with damnation, and sustains across its length a combination of comedy, eroticism, and supernatural dread that no subsequent opera has equaled. When the stone guest, the statue of the murdered commendator, arrives at Don Giovanni's dinner table, the music becomes something that belongs to the 19th century rather than the 18th. It is what Beethoven would have written if Beethoven had been Mozart. The Magic Flute, completed in 1791, was something different again, a fairy tale opera for a popular theater in the suburbs of Vienna, suffused with Masonic symbolism and spiritual allegory, in which a prince named Tamino undergoes trials of love and wisdom before earning enlightenment. Mozart had joined a Masonic lodge in 1784, and his engagement with its ideals of brotherhood, reason, and moral improvement runs through everything he wrote in his final years. The Magic Flute is simultaneously a children's story and a philosophical testament. The Stranger in Grey and the Requiem. In the summer of 1791, a man arrived at Mozart's door wearing grey and declined to give his name. He was carrying a commission for a requiem, a mass for the dead, from an anonymous patron. The patron was, as later investigation established, Count Franz von Walsegg-Stuppach, an aristocrat with the peculiar hobby of commissioning music from famous composers and then performing it as his own. Mozart did not know this. What he knew was that a stranger had appeared with a request for funeral music, and that he was already ill. He accepted the commission and began working on it alongside the Magic Flute, the Clarinet Concerto, and several smaller pieces. As his health deteriorated through the autumn, he became increasingly convinced that the Requiem was somehow intended for himself, that he was writing his own funeral music. Whether this was premonition, fever-induced anxiety, or something else, the conviction was real and it affected how he worked. He completed only the first movement, the introitus, in full orchestration. The remaining sections, Kyrie, Sequentia, Offertorium, he sketched in vocal parts and bass line, leaving the orchestration incomplete. On December 4th, the day before he died, friends gathered at his bedside and they went through the unfinished score together, with Mozart singing the alto part. He died the following morning at 1 a.m., aged 35 years and 10 months. The official cause of death was listed as acute miliary fever, a description so vague as to be essentially meaningless. Modern researchers have proposed rheumatic fever with kidney complications, streptococcal infection, and a dozen other possibilities. The theory that he was poisoned by Antonio Salieri, popularized by Pushkin's play and Peter Schaeffer's Amadeus, has no credible medical or historical support. Salieri was a competent composer who respected Mozart's work and conducted many of his pieces. The poison story is fiction that has proved more durable than the truth. Mozart was buried in a common grave at the St. Mark's Cemetery outside Vienna, not, as legend has it, in a pauper's burial, but in the standard middle-class interment that Emperor Joseph II's hygienic regulations required for most of the city's dead. The location of the specific grave was not recorded and cannot now be identified. Constanz commissioned his pupil Franz Xaver Sussmayr to complete the Requiem from the sketches, which Sussmayr did with varying degrees of success. The completed work, in the form that Sussmayr assembled it, became one of the most performed pieces of sacred music in the choral repertoire. What he left. Haydn, who knew him better than almost anyone, said, "Posterity will not see such a talent again in 100 years." He was being modest about the timeline. Beethoven's early works are saturated with Mozart's influence, and Beethoven reportedly improvised for Mozart in Vienna as a teenager, after which Mozart told the people in the room to watch the boy, he would make the world talk about him. Chopin requested that Mozart's Requiem be performed at his own funeral. Tchaikovsky called him the musical Christ and arranged several of his pieces for orchestra in a tribute suite. Schubert wrote in his diary that Mozart had shown him what life at its best could offer. He wrote K.1, a minuet, at the age of 5. He wrote K.626, the Requiem, while dying at 35. Between those two numbers are 624 pieces, in virtually every genre that existed in his time, at a level of quality that has given musicologists 624 different arguments about which one is the greatest. The answer, most of them eventually conclude, is that the question is wrong. The right question is which one you need today.